So I'm going to develop my thoughts into two major steps. The first one is, let's say, laying the basis for my thoughts, the Achaemenid Persian mental map and the ancient Near Eastern setting. And the second one is then moving forward into the time of Hellenism and the Roman Empire through late Antiquity, the Achaemenid Persian mental map and its imperial heritage. So let's start with the first part of my talk and immediately moving into the topic by dealing with the conquests of Cyrus the Great. Here you can see a map of his conquests, including the conquest of Cambyses, who took Egypt, as all of you know. One of the most important documents, sources we have for this early stage of Persian imperial self-representation is the so-called Cyrus cylinder in the British Museum. And I will just pick up some central passages of this most important document to exhibit the mental structure and how imperial world rule has been conceptualized in this very important source. So let us start with some lines, line 10 and 14. I'm always referring to the translation which you will find by Amélie Court. I'm just quoting Marduk, so the most important god of Babylon, Marduk to all the places whose dwelling places were and to the inhabitants of Sumer and Akkad, that is Babylonia, who had become like corpses, he turned his mind, he became merciful. He searched through all the countries, examined them, he sought a just ruler to sweet his heart, he took him by the hand, Cyrus, king of Anshan. He called for dominion over the totality, he named his name, Gutium, and all the Umanmanda he made subject to him. The black-headed people, so just an expression for the inhabitants of Babylonia, the black-headed people whom he allowed his hand to overcome, he protected in justice and righteousness. Marduk, the great Lord who cares for his people, looked with pleasure at his good deeds and his righteous heart. So as you can see, we see at first glance world rule defined within the Babylonian framework. It is the Babylonian god Marduk who takes action, who is the main agent of this important royal inscription. But what is also important is that the king as such, the new king of the world, is not anymore a Babylonian king. Marduk has become a god, a universal god, who is able to seek a righteous ruler even outside Babylonia, and that's exactly what he does. So the new king is on the one hand a universal king, a king who claims for world dominion, but he is not anymore a Babylonian king. And this is absolutely made clear by introducing Cyrus in these very crucial lines as king of Anshan. So for everyone reading and hearing that text, it was clear, yes, he is the new king selected by Marduk, but he is not anymore originating from Babylon. And there are two other important messages in this text. On the one hand, you have terms referring to totality, to universal rule, but then you have a specific focus on the East. And this very specific focus on the East is caught by these two terms, Gutium and Umanmanda, which are in the Babylonian framework age-old terms referring very vaguely, but nevertheless within the clear framework to the Eastern world as it is seen from a Babylonian perspective. So we have three major aspects which you can find here summarized. So Marduk, the king of the world, Cyrus as a king who was chosen by Marduk as king of the world, and very much specifying his rule in the East by these terms Gutium and Umanmanda. Of course, what has to follow in this universal perspective of world rule is the West and how the West has been conceptualized. And this we can see immediately in the following lines. So in the lines 20 to 22, we have again Cyrus introduced as king of the universe. So again, king of the totality. Mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad. Sumer and Akkad are two terms that are referring to Babylonia as such. But then and moving out from the Babylonian perspective into the perspective of world rule, king of the four quarters. This is also an age-old conception within Babylonia, originating already in the 3rd millennium BC, where the world is thought to be divided into four quarters. And if you rule all these four quarters, you are really the one who is able to claim world dominion. So Cyrus is a legitimate king again, but he is a non-Babylonian king, as we have already seen. And this non-Babylonian king, of course, refers to the place of his origin. This is this ancient Anshan, where Cyrus and his predecessor came to rule within the context of the former Elamite world. Let's move further in this very important text. You can see we encounter a whole set of phrases that conceptualize world rule on the one hand in a very specific Babylonian manner, but nevertheless within a very innovative framework. So he is now presented as the one, these are the crucial lines, at his great command, all the kings who sit on thrones from all parts of the world, from the upper sea to the lower sea, who dwell in distant regions, all the kings of Amuru who dwell in tents, brought their heavy tribute to me and kissed my feet in Babylon. So you can see again a change, or let's say a change in perspective at first hand, because the text changes from the third person to the first person. Cyrus introduces somehow in himself. And then the claim for world rule is, as we would probably phrase it in modern terms, somehow specified as he's a king of the civilized world, so all kings who are sitting on thrones, but as well as the non-civilized world, all the kings who dwell in tents, especially referring to Amuru. And there we encounter again an age-old term referring to the West. So if we put this in a whole picture, we can see that the world rule is conceptualized with Babylonia in the center, with these age-old terms Amuru in the west, Gutium and Umanmanda in the east. And this whole idea of world rule refers to its specific borders as a rule which is defined from the upper sea to the lower sea. And of course, if we put this in a modern geographical framework, it is the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean referring to the upper sea and the Persian Gulf referring to the lower sea. And this is again an age-old Babylonian conception of the world. The first time we encounter these ideas lead us again back to the 3rd millennium BC, so it's a Babylonian framework we encounter, and it is, so to say, put into picture by this very famous Babylonian world map, where you can see the world as such, surrounded by the ocean, and then there are also some places beyond the ocean, and this will become of major importance for our further considerations, that are somehow islands which are placed beyond the sea. But the world rule, the totality of world rule in the Cyrus cylinder is between the upper sea and the lower sea, so within these Babylonian borders of the world. So let's summarize these ideas which we have just introduced. So world rule is defined as the rule between the upper sea and the lower sea. There are specific terms which somehow give these ideas a special substance. All the kings who sit on thrones, as I called them, the civilized world, all the kings of Amur who are dwelling in tents, somehow referring, of course, to the pastoral nomadic worlds outside Babylonia. And then the eastern world with these two special terms, Gutium and Umanmanda. And of course, Cyrus as a legitimate king who has been approved by the Babylonian gods and who is residing in Babylon. So the fact that this idea of world rule does not come out of nowhere is already, or let's say has already been made clear, but nevertheless I just want to show you some specific examples from Neo-Assyrian times where you can see how much of this worldview, which was giving Cyrus his very specific legitimacy, is owed to his Neo-Assyrian predecessors. I'm just taking out two important examples. So the first one is from the reign of the Neo-Assyrian king Sargon II at the end of the 8th century BC. And you can already see I have underlined the specific phrases that world rule is again envisioned as a rule bordered by the ocean as the border of the world. So from the land of Yatnana, which is Cyprus actually, which is in the midst of the sea of the setting sun. So this is the west. Until the shore of the Bitter Sea, that is the Persian Gulf, as far as the border area of Dilmun. But you can also realize that there is a further aspect we so far did not have attested in Cyrus' inscription, that is already the claim that the world rule is somehow moving out into the ocean, and this is very much expressed by the two islands, so to say, as referring to this very specific claim. Yatnana, the island in the Western Sea, on the one hand, Cyprus, and Dilmun, which is actually Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. But there is even more in this text. We encounter some specific terms which we have also seen in the Cyrus cylinder, the term for the Gutiums referring to the east, Amuru referring to the west. And instead of the term Uman Manda, which actually refers to the Medes, we have the Medes called as they have been called since the 9th century BC in Neo-Assyrian text. So the distant Medes here. And we have also the claim of rule over different landscapes. I think this is also a very important aspect, and we will see this aspect again in the Persian Achaemenid inscription, because these different landscapes include mountains, and they also include deserts. So it's not only, let's say, the Babylonian and Assyrian central plains, but it's also mountains, deserts that define world rule. And then you have another, a very last aspect, which will also become of major importance in our further considerations, that you see, yes, there are the borders of the world, and these borders of the world are the ocean, but nevertheless, we face an enumeration of different lands that somehow define this kind of world rule. And it is interesting to note that this enumeration of world rule, as you can see here again, including Amuru, Gutium, and the Medes, and the different landscapes, has also been put into image in Neo-Assyrian times. Unfortunately, we do not have these images preserved of the different lands ruled by the Neo-Assyrian king, but we have at least one important text that tells us that there have been images of the lands that have been ruled by the Neo-Assyrian kings. And this is this important passage from Sargon's Annals within his, from his palace in Khorzabat. And I just read out these very important lines that will become important when you see what we have in Achaemenid Persian times. I depicted the settlements that I had conquered upon large limestone slabs and surrounded their palatial halls, lower courses with them. I made them an object of wonder. I placed inside these palatial halls representations. That's important. Representations. So simate in Babylonian. Representations made by the craft of the sculptor of the people of every land that I had conquered from east to west by the strength of the god Ashur, my lord. Of course, the god who gives legitimacy to the Neo-Assyrian king is the god Ashur. But you see there have not only been enumeration in written form, but also in pictorial form, as it is clearly testified by this important source, but unfortunately we do not have them. Of course we may try to reconstruct them, but and refer to models which we encounter later in Achaemenid Persian. And there is one pictorial representation in Neo-Assyrian times which might also guide us into this direction, and that's a very famous depiction of the successor of Sargon, the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib, as you can see here from his southwest palace in Nineveh. And if you look how the throne has been worked out, you see here representations of throne bearers. We actually do not know what they represent, but within a framework which I'm going to show you immediately, this kind of representation of peoples in the context of a throne gains major importance. Two further and last examples of this Neo-Assyrian conception of world rule I have to show to you. Both of them originates from one of a Neo-Assyrian king of the 7th century BC, that is Esarhaddon, who for the first time in the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered Egypt. And in this very inscription you can see how much the idea developed that the Assyrian world rule is not only, let's say, bordered by the ocean, but that it includes the ocean as well, and that it includes different landscapes as well. And you have the crucial lines again underlined. I conquered all of my arrogant enemies. Of course, the enemies of the Assyrian king are always arrogant ones. At the words of their divinity, the rulers, my enemies, trembled like reeds in a storm. The kings who live in the sea, whose inner walls are the sea and whose outer walls are the waves, who ride in boats instead of chariots, and who harness rowers instead of horses, were seized by my fear. And even more precisely in the next text, so the same ruler, this is again Esarhaddon expressing his absolute universal rule. You can read, neither he who made the sea his fortress, nor he who made the mountain his stronghold, escaped my net, or succeeded in escaping. I ordered the resettling of those of the sea to the mountains, and those of the mountains to the sea. So again, the sea, the mountains, the different landscapes. So this is how total universal world rule has been conceptualized in Neo-Assyrian times. So and now we are moving forward into Achaemenid times, into the successors of Cyrus and Cambyses, especially the time of Darius and the time of Xerxes, so at the term from the 6th to the 5th century BC, who ruled an empire that was the largest in its days, an empire that wasn't seen before from India to the eastern Mediterranean, so a completely new dimension of world rule which was introduced into these times. And one of the very first documents we have of where this kind of world rule is introduced to the public, or let's say, I would say to the elites of the empire, is of course this famous monument of Bisutun, again a combination of text and of pictorial representation. Darius, who has just beaten the 9 liar kings standing in front of him, and then as a later addition, I will come to this in a minute, Skuncha, the leader of the Saka Tigra Hauda. And in this very text, just let me summarize the major components of this important text. We face again an enumeration of lands, which is absolutely important, but we face a world rule where, at least at that very moment, at the beginning of Darius' reign, not yet peoples beyond the sea are conceptualized as being part of the empire. But nevertheless, the peoples let's say localized very specific borders they are now very peculiar, very specific, and that's what they will be also in the future. So we can see that here the Saka, the Greeks would say the Scythians, they are representing the eastern borders of the world, and the western borders are represented by a group combined by Lydia on the one hand and the Ionia, which may be equated to the Greeks in a larger sense. And then there is also, at this moment, only an anonymous people who dwell by the sea, not beyond the sea, but by the sea. So if you take this worldview together, it is a worldview that is quite similar to the one we have seen with the Cyrus cylinder. So it is a worldview, a world dominion of totality, bordered by the sea. But it's much more specific, much more developed. And of course, if we put the lands enumerated in this very text into a modern geographical order, we can see that the empire has become much, much larger. In a second step, Darius decided to change the monument considerably, and this has something to do with the victory he had celebrated, a victory over a chief of the Saka Digra Chauda. This was this Veriskuncha you can see here, and in order to add this Skuncha, you know, the first Elamite version of the text had to be destroyed because there was originally no space anymore, and so he had to put that relief into that former written column, so that the whole Elamite version had to be copied again once more. So obviously this victory was of utmost importance for Darius, because otherwise he would not have changed the whole monument to include his victory over this Skuncha. And there is also a textual addition which gives us some ideas about this victory. This is the very famous column 5 of the Pisitun inscription, and one which is only preserved, which was only written in Old Persian, whereas the original monument, as it has been conceptualized originally, was a trilingual, that is Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. This edition is only in Old Persian, so you can see that something changed. And of course this change really touches our topic considerably, because we can see that the mantle map is now expanding, is now further developing, and it's much more put into these footsteps of the Neo-Assyrian kings, as I have tried to demonstrate to you, that now for the first time within an Achaemenid Persian context we have also the claim for rule beyond the sea, so beyond the border, so even expanding his idea of world rule. I'm just reading out that text because this is really of major importance. Proclaims Darius the king, afterwards with an army I went against Scythia, so the eastern border of the world, the Saka. After that, the Scythians, who wear the pointed cap, this is the Saka Digra Chauda, these came against me when I had come down to the sea. And that's a difficult passage, and it's reconstructed, so we do not know how he did this, but with the whole army I crossed it. I crossed the sea. Afterwards I defeated those Scythians. Another part of them they captured. That was led to me in fetters. And the man who was their chief, Skuncha by name, you have just seen him in fetters, him they captured and led to me in fetters. There I made another their chief, as was my desire. After that the country became mine. So this is a considerable, let's say, expansion of the Persian mental map, and an expansion of the already established conception of world rule, and as such, of course, of major importance. And as already observed within the Pisitun inscription, with Darius there starts the tradition that this world rule is now specified by the enumeration of lands. We have plenty of examples of this kind of conceptualizing the world, especially from the inscriptions of Darius and his son Xerxes. And just to give you an example so that you can see how this looks like. So it is a whole demonstration of different parts of the land. Of course, we can put this in on a modern map and see these different ideas about how the land that was ruled by the Persian Achaemenid king has been structured. And again, this is not only a presentation in written form, but for the first time in Persian Achaemenid times, we see this now also developed in pictorial form. And of course, when you see these famous throne bearers, as they appear for the very first time on the tomb of King Darius at Naqsh-e-Rustam, and as such followed by all his Achaemenid successors until Artaxerxes III, you can see that the throne on which the king stands is held by a series of different people, and two tombs, that is one of Darius I and the one of Artaxerxes III, show, for God's sake, we have to say as historians, written labels, trilingual written labels, identifying all these people that are, so to say, holding the throne, holding the king, representing the empire as such. And it is not only the written identification which gives them historical substance, but also, and you can see it even in this reconstruction, they have different garments, they have different headgear, they have different weapons. So also the iconography is one of universality and difference. And this is of utmost importance, I think. And it is not only the tombs at Naqsh-e-Rustam who show this panorama of the world ruled by the great kings, but of course we have other stations very well known by you. I think the most famous probably are the delegations, the 23 delegations which we face on the Apadana in Persepolis. Unfortunately, at this time, these delegations are not identified by written labels, but only by different kinds of tribute. They bring different attire, so that there is, at least for some of them, there is still discussion within scholarship how to identify them. But that's not our topic right here. Our topic is to show how the world is thought, how the world is staged and presented, and it's a world controlled by the great king, and a world that is specifically qualified by its diversification. That's important. Diversification is an important term within this worldview. And of course, also this world has some borders. Another inscription from Persepolis, so Darius Persepolis, inscription H. This is the kingdom which I behold from the Saka who are beyond Sogdiana, from there as far as Kush, from the Indus as far as Sardis, which Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, bestowed upon me. Here again we have a specific idea of the borders of the world, and you can see this here in this map, which was originally created by Amélie Court and which puts these ideas perfectly together. And these borders of the world, as they have been introduced by the Persian Achaemenid kings, they become a specific meaning in later tradition, as I will try to show to you in my second part of my talk. So it is the Scythians in the northeast, India in the southeast, it is Sardis, Lydia, but also the Greeks in the northwest, and I would say it is a land to the south of Egypt, which in the inscriptions appears as Kush, but the Greeks would call it Ethiopia, which represents the border of the world in the south. And there is another aspect which I have to deal with, at least shortly. It is interesting that especially these border peoples, the border peoples in the east and the border peoples in the west, the Saka Scythians in the east and the Greek, the Yauna in the west, they are diversified again. And maybe this kind of diversification is also due to the fact that there were more and more closer contacts, so that the knowledge about this region of the world was growing. So you already encountered the fact that there are different Saka, different Scythians. Actually, it is three of them, the Saka Hauma Varga, the Saka Digra Chauda, one with the pointed cap, and those who live beyond the sea, the Saka Dayabara Draya. And this is also true for the Greeks, for the Yauna, who are also diversified. There is a very peculiar expression which we actually do not exactly know what it means. That's why I also just transcribe it, this Yauna Dakabara. But the other ones we do understand very well. So it is the Greeks of the mainland, the Greeks who dwell by the sea, and again the Greeks who dwell beyond the sea. So again the claim for world rule, including areas and regions beyond the sea. And the last aspect which has to be highlighted again, and which I somehow already introduced, is this very specific claim to rule the world as a, or let's say to define the rule of the world as a world of different landscapes, including not only different people, but also different landscapes. And the most important source for this very specific conception also originates again from the time of Darius, an inscription from Persepolis, but one this time which is only preserved in the Babylonian version. So we do not have a Old Persian or a Elamite component. And there, of course, first Darius is introduced as one who is legitimated by Ahura Mazda, as you all know, but then these are the crucial lines. And to Darius, the king, he is, of course, Ahura Mazda. He gave the kingship in this wide earth of many lands, among them Parsa, Media, and other lands, of another tongue, so again this diversification, of mountains and plain, of this near side of the sea and that far side of the sea, of this near side of the waterless desert and that far side of the waterless desert. So again you have a vision of world rule that is now somehow really developed in its largest extent. That means region beyond the sea have become part of the empire, and it is not only the alluvial plains, but it is also the waterless desert and the mountains which are part of the empire. So this is truly world rule, world dominion, as it has been defined in Achaemenid Persian times. So if we summarize what we have just been hearing and seeing by these important sources, how the idea of universalism, how the idea of world rule, how the mental map of the Persian Achaemenid times has been structured, how this language of power has been developing, we can summarize the following way. The dominion of the world is defined between the shores of the ocean, but also moving beyond. India is the eastern borderland of the world. Scythia is the northern one. The land south of Egypt, Kush or Ethiopia, take it as you like, is the southern one. And the west, and this is also important, remains somehow vague. It is true there is Lydia and Yauna, but nevertheless in the whole context, the west remains somehow vague. Also this gains momentum in the further discussion, as you will see immediately. And it is a world rule that includes control of inhabited as well as of uninhabited areas. A world rule that is diversified by a whole set of peoples and lands, and it includes, of course, deserts and mountains. And there is one aspect which I did not highlight so far, but which is also an heritage of Neo-Assyrian times. There is always the claim of one ruler to have outperformed what his predecessors have been doing. And in this kind of outperforming, there are some further aspects which I would like to mention. There it is. that is the transgression of rivers at the end of the world. You have seen Darius in this last episode of the Pisitun inscription, where he moved beyond the sea. This is the second aspect which is important, and it's combined with the erection of monuments, stelae and others at the end of the world, the enumeration of peoples, which we have just seen, and highlighting the control of land and sea. And this specific control, the claim to control land and sea, is also attested by our Greek sources, of course, which are important in this context and which I did not mention so far. There are 5 episodes in the histories of Herodotus where the Persians demand from the Greeks earth and water, let's say, so that the Greeks may accept the overlordship of the Persians, and expressing this with these specific terms, earth and waters, and of course hinting at the Persians as the masters of land and sea. And it is another important example within the histories of Herodotus that at least what we have for King Darius, that he was moving, at least in one episode, he was moving out into the sea, the king moving out into the sea, and somehow with this kind of ritualized act, showing his claim that his world rule does not end at the shores of the sea. So let us move from this background of how world rule has been developing in Persian Achaemenid times, how a very specific language of power has been introduced by the Persian Achaemenid Empire, has its heritage far beyond the existence of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And I will try to show this to you by, of course, referring only to some examples. You know, this could be a lecture of its own, or even a lecture series of its own, but I think that this is an especial important aspect which modern scholarship actually didn't take into consideration so much. And it is worth to be taken into consideration. Of course, I will start with Alexander III, who is insofar important in my talk that he is the one who is translating and transmitting ancient Near Eastern concepts of world dominion, or you may say Persian Achaemenid ones, within this ancient Near Eastern framework towards the West. Of course, I am well aware that there are plenty of problems concerning the sources that deal with Alexander the Great, because these sources, as far as they are preserved, are much later than Alexander, and of course there are later additions. But at the moment, let me take just these sources as important testimonies, also for how Alexander and his contemporaries conceptualized world rule. I will just refer to 3 important passages from the histories of Arrian, Arrian's Anabasis, where we have, or let's say where we gain important insights into this worldview. So one is at the end of Alexander's campaigning, this famous Opis speech, where Alexander addresses his troops in the following words. So I'm just going to read this important passage. And now it was Alexander's intention, excuse me, to send away only men unfit for war, to be the envy of those at home. But as you all desire to go, let all of you be gone. Return to your homes and report that your king Alexander defeated Persian, Medes, Bactrians, Sake, Scythians, subdued Uxians, Arachosians, Trangians, conquered Parthians, Chorasmians, Hyrcanians, as far as the Caspian Sea, went over the Caucasus beyond the Caspian gates, crossed the river Oxus and Tanais, and even the river Indus, which no one but Dionysos has crossed before, and the Hytaspes and Achaemenes and Hydraotes, and would have crossed the Hyphasis as well but for your apprehensions, and that he burst out on the great sea by both mouths of the Indus, and came through the Gedrosian desert, where no one had ever before gone with an army. So if we put this within a larger framework, a framework which I have just been introducing, we encounter major aspects which we are already knowing very well from Alexander's predecessors. The claim to transgress rivers, especially those at the border of the world, Oxus and Danais, of course, transgressing mountains, and ruling over different landscape, reaching the oceans as the borders of the world, moving out into the oceans, marching through deserts. So that's also an ancient Near Eastern, let's say, idea. The enumeration of conquered peoples and lands, control of the world, including the very eastern border people, that is India and Scythians, which is of utmost importance, and of course outperforming any predecessor, including gods, the god Dionysos, which you have just seen here. And it is again, if I may add just two further passages, it is again these specific borders of the world that deserve our attention. So it is Ethiopia in the south and it's the Scythian in the east that accept Alexander's claim of the world, and the west again remains vague. This is very important, as we have already seen in the Persian Achaemenid worldview. And expressis verbis, Alexander is introduced or is labeled as a master of every land and sea. So just what we have observed within this Persian Achaemenid context. So Alexander is ruler, truly the ruler of the world, because he is the master of the land and the sea. Of course, Alexander is the figure who transferred this idea into the epoch of Hellenism, and from the epoch of Hellenism, these ideas have been transferred to the Roman Empire. And I think a major figure who gains importance in this context is Pompey. You know, especially after the third war against Mithridates of Pontus, he gave the Near East a completely new order and presented himself and was presented in a completely new way, as I'm just going to demonstrate to you. So he is the one who translates and transmits ancient Eastern concept from the world of the successors towards the late Roman Republic. An important source for this is the work of Plutarch, his biographies, and of course Plutarch also dedicated one of these biographies to Pompey. And the context, the historical context I'm referring to is September 61 BC, when Pompey was celebrating his triumph, you know, after his victory over Mithridates and the new order he gave to the east. And just let me read out this important passage in the histories of Plutarch. His triumph, that is the triumph of Pompey, had such a magnitude that although it was distributed over 2 days, still the time would not suffice. But much of what had been prepared could not find a place in the spectacle enough to dignity and adorn another triumphal procession. Inscription born in advance of the procession indicated the nations over which he triumphed. These were, and then you have a long enumeration of different a long enumeration of different lands and peoples who have been, let's say, subdued by Pompey. So you have again aspects which we already have been encountering. You have an enumeration of conquered peoples, in Latin it's nationes or gentes, and you have the presentation of Pompey as someone who is Lord, who is the master over land and sea. And this is even put into a more specific language. And I'm moving to another important source, that is Pliny, who has preserved, for God's sake, a very important document. That is an inscription that Pompey erected in the temple of Minerva in Rome. The original text is lost, but Pliny preserved the text. And in this text, I'm going to read it out. It starts here. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, so he's Magnus the Great One, Imperator, having brought to an end a war of 30 years' duration, and having defeated, routed, put to the sword, or received the submission of 12,278,000 men, having sunk or captured 846 vessels, having received as allies 1,538 cities and fortresses, and having conquered all the countries, from the Maotis or to the Red Sea. So the new world, as it has been defined by the new master of land and sea, is defined as a world bordered by the ocean. In that very specific case, of course, adapted to the new geographical conceptions, but nevertheless put into a language of power which is very well set into an ancient Near Eastern context. World rule as defined as a rule between the borders of the ocean. And we can even add to this picture some inscriptions, dedication inscriptions, that were dedicated to Pompey, especially by cities of Western Asia Minor. In the 60s, that is one by the Ionian Koinon, and where he is introduced as ges kai thalasses epoptein. And this epoptes is a very specific Greek term for lord and master, which is also used to qualify the god Zeus. So it gives Pompey a specific position even beyond, let's say, a human being, and he is the lord of land and sea, ges kai thalasses. So lord of land and sea, something which was of course attributed to Alexander, but as we have already seen, has a much larger heritage. And of course, this new claim of world rule presented within a very specific language of power is also connected with the erection of monuments. Pompey did a famous monument, also lost, but nevertheless the description of which is preserved again in the work of Pliny, somewhere in the western regions of the world, so probably close to the Col de Perthus. But the fact as such is of major importance. Of course, we have to lose some words about Caesar, who at the beginning was an important ally of Pompey. And again, it is Plutarch who gives us very specific and important information. So there is a very famous passage which I'm just rephrasing, where Caesar is said to have read in the histories of Alexander, and where Alexander is somehow presented as a role model for Caesar. And of course, we not only refer to Alexander, but we see this larger background behind Alexander. But this becomes even more substantial in another important passage from Plutarch. So the historical background is the time when Caesar was governor pro praetor in one of the two Spanish provinces of that time. That's the southern one, Hispania Ulterior, in the late 60s. And of course, this is also the time you have to put this into the very context. This is the time after Pompey was already celebrating his triumph, and when Pompey had already reordered the East. So this is a perfect framework of competition between these two noblemen, between Caesar and Pompey. And it is at that very time that Caesar campaigned as governor of Hispania Ulterior to one of the westernmost people of the world, the Lusitani, in nowadays Portugal. And this is again phrased in a very specific language, because he is said to have marched as far as the outer sea. So again, okay, Pompey went to the very east, to the eastern borders of the land, but Caesar went to the western border of the land, as far as the outer sea. And this is also more specified in later times, especially in the 50s during the campaigns of Caesar in Gallia, when especially in the framework of his campaign against Britain, where it is said, I just read the first two lines, his expedition against the Britanni was celebrated for its daring, for he was the first to launch a fleet upon the Western Ocean, to sail through the Atlantic Sea, and carrying an army to wage war. So here again, Caesar transcends the western edges of the world. He is the first one, again this framework of competition, he is the first one to move with his navy into the Western Ocean. And the motive of outperforming any predecessor is also clear, and responding to Pompey's res gestae, Pompey who was already dead, during, who was not already dead, but where the confrontation, gained momentum to be then decided in favor of Caesar some years later. This picture can even be more complete in another passage of Plutarch, which refers to the so-called final plans of Caesar. Whether these have been true plans or whether just ideas, this does not play any role for our discussion, because it's just this rephrasing of an age-old mental map that is let's say, staged within this very context. And of course, it includes not only an expedition against the Parthian, but also an expedition to the eastern borders of the world. And if you want to go to the eastern borders of the world, you have to claim to invade Scythia, as we have already seen in the example of the Persian Achaemenid kings, and you have to come to the eastern borders of the world bound by, so that the world rule is really bound on all sides by the ocean. Exactly what is here claimed as the last plans of Caesar is just what we have already seen by Cyrus, as it has been accomplished, a world rule that includes all sides of the ocean. And the very last point I would like to lose on Caesar. He is also said to have had in mind some huge infrastructural programs. And one of these is said to have planned to dig through the Isthmus of Corinth. So of course, you may take this as just a nice idea. But if you put this again into an imperial framework, and if you see, what the Persian kings have done, especially Darius with his channel building between the river Nile and the Red Sea, again, these specific claims gain a completely different meaning, a meaning set within a larger history of much larger meaning. So let's move a little bit further from the late Republic into the Roman imperial times, and of course it is Augustus who is just translating and transmitting these, as I would call it now, ancient Eastern concept of world dominion into the late Republic and beyond. And of course, the most important document for this is probably the most famous inscription of the Roman Empire. These are the res gestae of Augustus, so his testament, so to say, where he defines his world rule in a very specific language as a world rule that which was neither bound by land nor by sea, has any Roman before this time gone. So again, this idea of outperforming any predecessor, and of course it has to include rules. It has to include regions that were again from the background of an age-old tradition that leads us immediately back into the Near East, defined by very specific lands which are representing the borders of the land. So this is Ethiopia, the land to the south of Egypt, and of course also Arabia, and put in modern phrasing of that time, Nabata and Meroe. But again, India has to play its major role, and I'm going to read out this important passage. Embassies of kings from India were often sent to me, such as have not ever been seen before this time in the presence of any Roman general. The Bastarnae sought our friendship through envoys, and the Scythians and kings of the Sarmatians, who are on both sides of the river Don. So again, of course, he could not claim that he has really subdued the Scythians and the Indians, but at least, by having accepted envoys, embassies from India and from the Scythians, this claim of world rule is put again within a framework that is clearly of ancient Near Eastern origin. And of course we also have a number of important pictorial representations of this kind of world rule. One of the most famous one, and it's housed in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, is this famous Gemma Augustea, And of course you can see here Augustus, and especially important are the figures behind him, because it is oikumene, okeanos, so the world, ocean, and Italia, so that he is really introduced again as a master of land and sea. And we already knew this from Persian Achaemenids through Alexander and Pompey's time. And even here, also here, of course, I have to mention Virgil, who defines Augustus' empire as an imperium sine fine, as an empire without border. But what I want to demonstrate is that we also have inscriptions of Emperor Augustus, where he is described as master of land and sea in the very same way as we have already observed with Pompey. So this is the example of Pompey, which I have already introduced to you. And there are two examples of Augustus, where you have again this terminology, master epoptes ges kai thalasses, of land and sea, and of course introducing his title in the Greek language, Augustus Sebastos Theos Kaiser Autokrator. And we can follow up this kind of claim of world rule, master of land and sea, at least until late antiquity, until the 3rd century, with this example of Gordian the third, who is not anymore epoptes but despotes of land and sea and different people and ethne in between. And again, there are plenty of examples where this world rule is not only defined by the enumeration of people, but also in a pictorial way. An important example is the Hadrianeum, so this important temple erected by Emperor Hadrian, where 24 personifications of nationes or provincia, including Parthia and Scythia, is represented in Rome. And a very interesting example is a coin series of the late 2nd century Emperor Antoninus Pius, where different provinces are somehow, or lands are offering a specific gift to the emperor, such, let's say, respecting his overlordship. This is the so-called aurum coronarium, and you will immediately see that what we face is not actual real rule, but it is a mental map where world rule is defined within an already existing framework. Because it is said that also Parthia was offering this aurum coronarium, so the Roman emperor claims to be the lord of the whole world, including also Armenia, as you can see here. But the most interesting part, in my opinion, is that Scythia again is included. So if you want to claim to be a true ruler of the world, you have to include specific regions, and these regions have already been defined in an ancient Near Eastern context. And another important literary source where we face this fantastic panorama is a work of the late 1st century AD. This is a Roman poet and a politician, Silius Italicus, who wrote a very famous epos, the Punica, dealing with the Second Punic War against Hannibal. But there is also a very important passage in the 3rd book where Jupiter is somehow developing an idea of the future of Rome. So at the moment when in that work Rome is very much threatened by Hannibal and is in danger to be completely destroyed, Jupiter develops an idea about the future of the Roman Empire. And this passage, by the way, is very important for dating the work of Silius Italicus, because it reveals or it develops an idea about the future Roman emperors Vespasian, Titus and Domitian, so the Flavian dynasty, and it makes clear that Silius Italicus is a contemporary of this episode. And he develops the idea of first father, so the founder of the Flavian dynasty shall give Rome victory over Thule, so the outer island in the Western Sea, unknown till then, and shall be the first to lead an army against the Caledonian forests. So again, this outperforming any predecessor. And the same is true with Titus, but the most important part is connected with Domitian, because he shall not only outdo the exploits of the father and brother, again outperforming, but the people of the Ganges shall one day lower their unbent bows before him, and Bactra display its empty quivers. He shall drive the triumphal car through Rome after conquering the north. The north he shall triumph over the east, and Bacchus give place to him. So again, world rule, true world rule, and this will become true at the time of Domitian, has to include the eastern borders of the world as they have been defined by the Achaemenids. It has to include India. This is absolutely true. And this, we can follow up this until late antiquity. So there's this very famous Barberini diptychon showing a Roman emperor, of course now in a Christian attire. It is not absolutely clear who it is. Is it Justinian? But it is absolutely clear that we are somehow in the 6th century AD. And what is important, how this world rule is visualized, and it's this passage below which is of importance right now, because it includes, of course, the Iranian Empire of the Sasanians, as you can see here in their very typical attire, but it also includes India again, as you can see by the ivory horns and as you can see by the tiger. So true world rule has to include India as defining the eastern border of the world, and actually it has again also be an empire that is bounded by the shores of the sea, as one passage of the novella of Justinian of the year 536 reveals, so as to give us hope to retain the government of the other countries between the confines of the two oceans. So perfectly set into a worldview that leads us immediately back to the 3rd millennium BC of ancient Eastern times, and which was so much developed by the Persians and Achaemenids. Of course, there were also Roman authors, who knew, okay, we have to distinguish between claim and between reality. That's also true. And the histories of Jordanes, so first half of the 6th century, his Roman history gives a very nice passage about this kind of irony. So saying how the Roman state began, endured, subdued almost the entire world, and holds it to this day in imagination at least. So he is playing with this kind of claims. And the very last passage I'm going to show you is another one of the 6th century, a part of one of the famous works of Procopius, De Edificiis, where he tells us that Emperor Justinian was erecting an equestrian statue of his in the center of Constantinople, and he describes the statues in any detail. Upon this horse is mounted a colossal bronze figure of the emperor, and so on. And he looks toward the rising sun, so he looks towards the east, towards the Parthians, towards the Sasanians, and towards India. He looks towards the rising sun, directing his course, I suppose, against the Persians. And in his left hand he holds a globe, representing true world rule, by which the sculptor signifies that the whole earth and sea are subject to him. The whole earth and sea. Yet he has neither sword nor spear nor any other weapon, but a cross stands upon the globe, which he carries, the emblem by which alone he has obtained both his empire and his victory in war. Of course, this is now a Christian, let's say, addition of world rule, but then again, it ends, and stretching forth his right hand towards the rising sun, and spreading out his fingers, he commands the barbarians, the Persians and the Indians, in that quarter to remain at home and to advance no further. And if we put this into the context, into the larger context, we can not only say that Justinian is presented as ruler of the world, as a master of land and sea, and keeping the Persians at bay, but it is exactly the Persians to whom the conceptualization of world rule encapsulated in a specific language of power, and woven into a characteristic mental map is actually owed to. Thank you for your attention.